Welcome back. Find a comfortable position and let the day begin to fall away. Tonight, let's slip quietly into the dark, still legend of the creature haunting New Jersey's Pine Barrens. If these carry you off to sleep, subscribe. A new one comes every night. A pitch pine stands alone at the edge of a cleared sandy plain in the interior of southern New Jersey, and if the afternoon is warm enough, which in July it almost always is, the smell of its resin reaches a person before anything else about it does. The bark is the first thing to notice up close. It runs in thick, irregular plates, dark brownish gray, deeply furrowed between the ridges, each plate slightly raised and rounded, the whole surface looking less like the covering of a living thing and more like the cooling surface of something that survived something very hot. The furrows run vertically in long channels and then cross and divide, making shapes that have no name and no pattern and repeat anyway, all the way from the base of the trunk up to the first cluster of branches, where the bark thins slightly and the wood beneath it turns a warmer color in the slanted light. The roots spread outward through sand that would defeat almost any other tree. Most trees need soil in the way most people understand soil: dark, loamy, mineral-rich, the kind that holds moisture and gives nutrition back. The pitch pine needs almost none of that. It holds in pale, coarse, nearly white quartz sand that drains within minutes of a rainstorm and gives back almost nothing, and it holds there not despite the conditions, but because of them, having spent thousands of years becoming exactly the thing this particular kind of difficult ground produces. The scientific name for this tree is Pinus rigida, and the rigida refers to the stiffness of the needles, which grow in bundles of 3 and project outward from the branches at sharp angles, giving the whole crown a slightly bristled, untidy appearance that is different from the softer silhouettes of white pine or eastern red cedar. At the tips of some of the smaller branches, in late summer, there are cones. They are small and roughly oval, brown and resinous, and their scales are pressed together with a tightness that is not incidental. Each scale is sealed against the others by a natural resin that the tree produces continuously and that hardens into something close to glue under ordinary conditions. The seeds inside are alive and viable and perfectly capable of germinating, and they will remain that way for years, or in some cases for longer than a decade, while the cone sits sealed on the branch through summer heat and autumn rain and winter cold and spring warmth, waiting for a condition the forest around it will eventually produce. The condition is fire. Only the intense, sustained heat of a wildfire moving through the understory is capable of melting the resin that holds the scales locked, and when that heat arrives, the cone opens and the seeds fall into the cleared ash-fertilized ground left behind after the flames have passed. Botanists have a term for cones that behave this way. They are called seritinous, from a Latin root meaning late or delayed, and the pitch pine is one of the more striking examples of the adaptation found anywhere in North American forests. The sealed cone on the branch in late summer, its scales locked against the resin, holding its seeds in suspension for a season that has not yet come, is one of the defining objects of the Pine Barrens. It contains something close to a summary of the place, a long patience, a willingness to wait for conditions that will seem destructive from the outside, but that are, from the inside of the cone's particular logic, the only conditions under which the next generation can actually begin. The Pine Barrens is the name most people use for the landscape formally designated as the Pinelands National Reserve, and it encompasses approximately 1 billion acres across 7 counties in the southern part of New Jersey. That number takes a moment to settle into. 1.1 million acres in a state that is, by general reputation, one of the most densely developed and heavily traveled in the country, a state that most people who have only driven its highways associate with the industrial corridor between New York and Philadelphia, with refineries and turnpike traffic and suburban sprawl running in an almost uninterrupted band from one end to the other. The Pine Barrens sits east and south of all that, and it is the largest remaining tract of open land on the eastern seaboard between Richmond, Virginia, and Boston, Massachusetts, which means that within a 2-hour drive of more than 20 million people, there is a place where a person can walk for a full day without crossing a road or hearing traffic, where the tree canopy extends unbroken to the horizon in every direction, where at night the stars are dark enough to show the Milky Way as a faint structural band across the sky. The people who live near it know it is there. A great many who live farther away do not, or think of it as a small remnant rather than a functioning, ecologically coherent landscape of genuine scale. Within those 1 million acres, the landscape is not uniform. There are cedar swamps, and open bogs, and shallow streams, and sandy uplands, and wet lowlands, and disturbed margins, where old agricultural ground is being slowly reclaimed by vegetation. But the character of the place, the quality that gives it its name and its feel, comes from the interior, where the pitch pine is the dominant tree, and the soil underfoot is that pale draining sand, and the understory between the widely spaced trunks is low and open, scrubby with blueberry and bearberry, and sheep laurel, thin-leaved plants that can manage in the dry, acidic conditions between the trees. The openness of the interior forest is something a visitor notices almost immediately. This does not look like the closed, dense woodland of the Northeast's mixed hardwood forests, where the trees crowd each other, and the ground beneath them is shaded and thick with undergrowth. The pitch pine forest is more like a park, in the plain sense of the word, widely spaced trees, clear sightlines between them, the ground visible between the stems of the low shrubs. The openness is not accidental. The open, widely spaced stands of pitch pine characteristic of the Pine Barrens interior are a direct product of wildfire, not a natural default condition of the landscape. Without the recurring disturbance of fire, the succession in most of the pinelands would move toward a denser, more closed woodland, toward oak and mixed hardwoods in the drier areas, toward Atlantic white cedar in the wetlands. Fire interrupts that succession and resets it. It kills the competing species that are less tolerant of heat and disturbance. It clears the accumulated leaf litter and dead organic matter from the forest floor. It opens the serotinous cones of the pitch pine and deposits the seeds into bare, mineral ground where competition is temporarily reduced and germination is possible. The pitch pine thrives in the post-fire environment not by avoiding fire, but by depending on it, by being at a fundamental biological level a creature of fire in a landscape that fire visits regularly. Wildfire historically swept through portions of the pinelands every 5 to 15 years on average. That is a short interval. Most of the eastern forests of North America, where fire is less frequent, have developed under conditions where decades or even centuries can pass between major burns. The pinelands developed under a very different schedule, and the entire ecology of the place reflects that. The plants that grow here are not simply tolerant of fire. Many of them are shaped by it in ways that run deep into their biology. Pitch pines can resprout from their trunks after a fire has killed the crown, producing tufts of new needles from dormant buds protected beneath the thick bark. Blueberry and bearberry and many of the other low shrubs resprout vigorously from their root systems, after the above-ground portion has burned. The sandy soil itself, by draining rapidly and providing little organic moisture to carry smoldering combustion, means that fires tend to move quickly through the pinelands rather than burning deep and hot into the ground, which allows the root systems of the adapted plants to survive and begin their recovery within days of a fire passing through. Modern fire suppression over much of the 20th century altered this pattern significantly, allowing vegetation to accumulate in ways that the historical landscape would not have permitted. And one of the ongoing management challenges in the pinelands is determining how to reintroduce fire in a controlled way into a landscape that surrounds communities and infrastructure that fire cannot be allowed to reach. The controlled burns conducted in winter months, when fuel moisture is higher and winds are lower, are a careful attempt to replicate what the landscape produced naturally for thousands of years, and watching one move through the understory on a calm day in January or February, the flames low and orange against the pale sand, the pitch pines standing untouched above the fire line, while the ground between them is cleared to bare mineral soil, gives some sense of how ordinary this event is in the long context of the pinelands, how unremarkable the fire is to a landscape that has been having this conversation with it for as long as the pitch pine has been here. Beneath the sandy floor of the pine barrens, below the roots of the pitch pines, and the shallow-rooted blueberry shrubs, and the sphagnum moss of the bogs, there is water, an enormous, still, slowly moving body of water that occupies the spaces between the grains of sand and gravel, far below the surface, held in a geological formation known as the Cohansey Aquifer. The estimated volume of water in the Cohansey Aquifer is approximately 17 trillion gallons. That figure is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, and perhaps the most useful way to approach it is not through the abstraction of the number, but through what it produces at the surface: the springs that feed the pine barrens streams, the seeps that keep the cedar swamps saturated through the driest summers, the slow upward pressure of groundwater that maintains the high water table across much of the low-lying interior and makes the landscape, despite its sandy, quickly draining surface, a place of enormous hydrological richness. The water beneath the pines is very clean, filtered through layer after layer of that pale quartz sand on its long journey downward from the surface. It is old water, in the sense that the time between rain falling on the surface and water emerging from a spring deep in the interior can be measured in years or decades rather than hours, and the aquifer as a whole represents an accumulation of water on a time scale that requires thinking in thousands of years rather than any smaller unit. The water that rises from the aquifer and begins moving across the surface does something that surprises people who encounter it for the first time. It turns dark, not murky. The water of a pine barren stream is actually quite clear in the sense that it is not turbid, does not carry suspended particles, does not look cloudy or dirty in the way that a disturbed pond might, but it is the color of strong tea or of dark amber, ranging from a light honey brown in shallower, faster-moving reaches to something approaching the color of black coffee, where it pools in the deep, slow interior of a cedar swamp. The color comes from tannins, compounds dissolved into the water as it percolates through the accumulated organic matter of the pine barrens floor. Fallen leaves, rotting logs, decomposing sphagnum moss, the slow breakdown of organic material in the waterlogged peaty ground of the swamps, all of these contribute compounds that stain the water a warm dark color and make the streams of the pine barrens immediately recognizable to anyone who knows what they are looking at. The tannins also make the water acidic, with pH levels in many pine barren streams running well below what most freshwater organisms require, which is part of why the ecology of these waterways is so specific. The species that live in them are ones that have adapted over long periods to conditions that most aquatic life could not tolerate. Atlantic white cedar trees grow along many of these streams, and they are the defining image of the pine barrens' interior wetlands. They grow in close formation, their trunks rising straight and dark from water, the color of steeped tea, their crowns pressing together overhead to form a canopy that shades the stream surface to near darkness, even on a bright summer day. The interior of a white cedar swamp in the middle of the day has the quality of a room where the lights have been dimmed, not dark, but not fully lit either. The light that reaches the water's surface, filtered and soft and green tinged from the living canopy above. The surface of the water in the windless interior of such a swamp is perfectly still in a way that open water rarely is, because the cedars and the low shrubs around them break the wind before it can reach the water. What sound there is in a cedar swamp on a still day comes from within, from the birds moving in the canopy, from the occasional drip of water from a branch, from the faint, almost subliminal sound of the stream itself moving below the surface of the standing water in the swamp interior. The word for these swamps in the old regional vocabulary of the Pine Barrens is spungs, and it is one of those words that is almost exclusively local, meaning that to use it correctly is to situate oneself, at least linguistically, within the specific geography of the pines. The acidity of the Pine Barrens water and the saturated peaty character of the boggy ground create conditions that support a range of plants found almost nowhere else in the mid-Atlantic region, among them occupying a narrow ecological band at the edge of certain bogs and seeps in the interior of the pines is one of the smallest ferns in North America. The curly grass fern, its scientific name is Schizea pusilla, and both the common name and the Latin speak accurately to its appearance, because the fronds curl in a way that is quite distinctive, spiraling slightly at their tips when they are young, and then holding a gentle, irregular curl as they mature, is a plant so small and so easily overlooked that it requires a deliberate, close-looking search to find it. It stands only a few centimeters tall in most cases. Its fronds are thin and grass-like, and it grows rooted in the same saturated peaty ground it has occupied for thousands of years, holding on in a habitat that exists in almost no other location in eastern North America. There are a handful of disjunct populations in scattered locations in Canada, but the main North American concentration of curly grass fern is here, in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, in the peaty margins of the acidic bogs and seeps that the Coansey Aquifer helps to maintain. It is a plant from another time, in a certain sense, a relic of a different distribution, persisting in the specific refuge of conditions that the Pine Barrens provides. Finding the curly grass fern requires knowing where to look, and then looking with genuine attention. It grows at the edge of boggy clearings, often among sphagnum moss and sedges and other small plants that make it easy to overlook, and the experience of locating one and crouching down to examine it is the experience of understanding, at a very small scale, what makes the Pine Barrens worth paying attention to. This landscape is not dramatic in the way that mountain ranges or coastlines or ancient forests are dramatic. It is not immediately arresting. A person driving through the Pine Barrens for the first time might find the interior flat, monotonous, the sandy roadsides and scrubby pines and low shrubs unremarkable in comparison to more obviously picturesque landscapes. The scale and the interest of the place reveal themselves slowly and in detail, through repeated attention, through learning what the distinctions between one kind of bog and another actually mean, through understanding why the curly grass fern can grow here and almost nowhere else on the Atlantic seaboard. The Pine Barrens is not a landscape that announces itself. It asks for something more patient than a first impression. The pitch pine itself, standing at the edge of a sandy clearing in afternoon heat, is a good teacher of this kind of attention. The bark is the beginning of it, those thick, deeply furrowed plates that have accumulated over decades of growth, each ridge a slightly different color depending on the angle of the light. Darker in the furrows where moisture lingers after rain, warmer and more reddish on the raised ridges where the afternoon sun reaches directly. Running a hand along the bark of a mature pitch pine, the texture under the fingers is rough, without being sharp, the ridges yielding slightly under pressure, the resin present not as a sticky coating, but as a faint, dry, warm smell that is released by the heat of the skin against the surface. It smells like something very old and very patient, and not at all troubled by the temperature, or the season, or the sandy, nutrient-thin ground it has been growing in for 60 or 80 or 100 years. The pitch pine does not look like a tree that is being tested by its circumstances. It looks like a tree that long ago settled into exactly the right relationship with them. The roots spread into the sand in a way that is less visible above the surface, but can be inferred from what happens at the base of the trunk, where the bark thickens and the lower boles of older trees often show a swelling and a complexity at ground level that speaks to the work happening below. The root systems of pitch pines in the penlands are extensive relative to the size of the above-ground tree, reaching outward through the sand in search of what moisture and mineral content the substrate offers, holding the tree against the wind that comes through the flat interior. There are no hills here to break it, with a grip that must be distributed across a very large area to compensate for the shallowness of the ground and the inability of the sand to provide much structural anchor on its own. A pitch pine in a winter windstorm looks from a distance like a tree that is working. Up close, with the roots in mind, it looks like a tree that has already done the work necessary to not have to worry about it. The cleared sandy plain at the edge of which the pitch pine stands is itself a product of the fire cycle. The open areas scattered through the pine barrens interior, sandy clearings where the vegetation is sparse and low, where the ground is pale and mineral and the shadows of the few surrounding trees fall long and dark across exposed quartz sand, are places where recent fire has burned away the accumulated growth, where the pine seedlings that will eventually fill this space have only just germinated, or where repeated burning has kept the succession in a perpetual early stage that allows plants adapted to sun and open ground to maintain their footing. Some of these clearings have a quality of exposure that the dense interior lacks. The sky is larger here. The light falls directly on the pale sand and makes it glow faintly in the low sun of afternoon. The shadows of whatever is growing in the clearing, scattered seedlings, low blueberry, the occasional stiff stem of broom's edge, long and precise on the pale surface. It is into ground like this that the seeds from those sealed pitch pine cones will fall when fire finally comes and opens them. They will fall into bare mineral soil, into the kind of clean, empty substrate that is available in no other moment in the pine barren cycle, after the competing vegetation has been burned away, after the ash has briefly amended the acidity of the sand, before the blueberry and the bracken fern and the scrub oak have had time to come back and claim the light. The seeds are small and winged, adapted for wind dispersal across the open ground of a post-fire clearing, and in the weeks after a fire, they can sometimes be found lying on the pale sand in numbers that give some sense of how many the tree was holding in readiness, each one a future pitch pine or a potential one, depending on conditions that will play out across years. Most will not survive. Those that do will grow slowly in the poor sand, and after enough decades, they will be the ones holding their own serotinous cones sealed against the branch, waiting for the fire that is, in the long arithmetic of the pinlands, always eventually coming. The flat character of the pine barrens interior is easy to mistake for uniformity, but the low relief of the landscape creates a hydrological complexity that is anything but uniform. The difference of only a few inches in elevation between one part of the sandy plain and another determines whether the ground will be dry enough for pitch pine or wet enough for sphagnum moss, whether a cedar swamp will form or whether the vegetation will stay low and open, whether a particular spot will hold water through the summer or drain within days of rain. The Pine Barrens is a landscape in which very small changes in the ground surface produce large changes in what grows there, and walking across it with attention to what the vegetation is actually doing reveals a much more textured and differentiated world than the flat horizon suggests. A botanist working in the Pine Barrens in the 19th century described it as a place where the map of what grows where is drawn not by the large contours of the land, but by the subtle ones, the slight rise of a sandy ridge, the gentle depression of a swale, the presence or absence of an inch of peat below the surface. Rain that falls on the Pine Barrens moves through the landscape in two directions at once. Some of it runs across the surface, picking up tannins from the leaf litter and moving into the streams. Most of it moves downward, percolating through the sandy floor, passing through layer after layer of clean white quartz sand, descending through the substrate toward the vast, still body of the Coensee Aquifer far below. The percolation is gradual, filtered, slow. The sand removes particles. The distance removes other things. By the time water that fell as rain reaches the aquifer, it has been passing through natural filtration for long enough that it emerges in the Pine Barrens springs in a state of cleanliness that is difficult to achieve by artificial means, which is part of why the aquifer has attracted attention from water scientists and planners and conservation advocates who understand what it represents in a region of the country where clean, abundant fresh water is not unlimited. A night of steady rain on the Pine Barrens brings all of this into a kind of soft motion. The surface drains quickly because the sand takes the water immediately. No pooling on the surface, no flooding across the open plains. The water simply disappears into the ground within hours of falling. Below the surface, in the spaces between the sand grains, the movement continues in the dark, a slow and patient descent that will take months or years before the water joins the larger body below. The sound of rain in the pitch pine forest is different from the sound of rain in a hardwood forest. The needles of the pitch pine are stiff and closely spaced, and rain striking them produces a sharper, higher sound than the broad, soft leaves of a maple or an oak would give. In a cedar swamp during rain, the sound is different again. The cedars break and slow the rain before it reaches the water below, and what arrives at the surface is not drops, but a fine mist, a diffused drizzle that barely disturbs the dark mirror of the stream's surface. The cedar streams run dark and slow through the interior, and the movement of tannin-stained water through the swamps carries with it something dissolved from everything upstream, from every fallen cedar log rotting in the water, from every mat of sphagnum slowly releasing its acids, from the shed needles of the pines on the slopes above the stream's headwaters, from the peaty soil of the boggy margins that the stream passes through on its way toward the larger drainage systems that eventually reach the coast. The darkness of the water is a record, in some sense, of every surface it has touched and everything it has slowly dissolved in the miles above. The tannins that color it are organic compounds from plant material, and they carry no harm. The water is simply doing what water does in this landscape, picking up the chemistry of the ground it passes through and carrying it along as a kind of dissolved history. The streams flow quietly. In the interior, away from the points where they pass under roads or through managed channels, they move without sound that reaches a person standing a few feet from the bank. The surface reflects the cedar canopy above it in a way that is slightly distorted, the reflections dark and soft-edged, the movement of the water detectable only by the slow progress of a leaf or a small piece of debris drifting across the surface. Below the dark water, the bottom is pale sand, the same quartz sand that makes up the dry uplands above, visible through a foot or two of tannin-colored water as a lighter tone below the amber darkness. In the clearer stretches of fast-moving streams, where the water moves over shallow riffles between stretches of deeper pools, this contrast between the dark water above and the pale sand below is one of the more quietly striking visual effects in the Pine Barrens, something that is very easy to walk past without registering, and very easy to stop and look at for longer than intended. All of this, the pitch pine and the sealed cones and the sandy floor and the pale aquifer below and the dark streams above and the cedar swamps and the tiny ferns at the boggy margins, is part of the same system, not a collection of interesting separate things, but a coherent, interlocking ecology that has developed over thousands of years in this specific place, with this specific soil, and this specific fire regime, and this specific hydrology, producing exactly the landscape that exists here and nowhere else in quite this form. The Pine Barrens is a singular place in the way that genuinely singular things always are, not because it has been made dramatic or preserved behind glass, or designated as important by external authority, though it has been protected, formally, since the late 1970s, but because the particular combination of conditions that produced it is not duplicated anywhere else, and the things that grew out of those conditions are therefore not found anywhere else in quite the same configuration. The 17 trillion gallons of water in the Cohansey aquifer sit beneath all of it, patient and enormous, and dark in the way that all underground water is dark, held in the spaces between sand grains that have been in place since the sea withdrew from this part of the continent thousands of years ago. The aquifer receives its water from above and releases it slowly at the surface, feeding the springs that feed the streams that feed the cedar swamps that carry the tannin-stained water slowly toward the coast. The water moving along the surface of a Pine Barren cedar stream on any given afternoon has been on a long journey, down through the sand from the surface, held in the dark below for a time measured in years, then released upward through a spring and set moving across the surface, picking up the dissolved chemistry of everything it passes through, running dark and quiet through the swamp interior, carrying the faint dissolved memory of every fallen leaf and rotting log and shed needle it has touched on its way, moving slowly and without hurry through a landscape that has been going about this same business, quietly and at its own pace, for longer than there has been anyone here to give it a name. Daniel Leeds sat at a writing table in his New Jersey home in the autumn of 1687, surrounded by books that would have looked to most of his neighbors like the library of a man who read too widely for his own good. There were texts on natural philosophy. There were volumes that touched on the movements of planets and the older traditions of reading meaning into those movements. Outside the window, the pines stood in their long, ordinary rows, and the light came through at an angle that suggested the afternoon was already thinking about evening. Leeds was preparing the manuscript of an almanac, a practical document by the conventions of the time, the kind of thing colonial households relied on for planting calendars and weather expectations, and the general coordination of life with the turning of seasons. He could not have known, working at that table, that the controversy this document would eventually produce would attach something strange and monstrous to his family's name for 3 centuries. He was writing an almanac. He was trying, in the way of many colonial intellectuals, to reconcile the empirical study of the natural world with the older symbolic systems that still gave that world its texture and meaning. The almanac would go badly for him. The name would persist long past the going. The Philadelphia Quaker community that Daniel Leeds belonged to did not receive his 1687 almanac warmly. The leadership of the Society of Friends found its content deeply objectionable, not the practical calendar sections, but the astrological charts and the esoteric symbols printed alongside them, the suggestions of a framework for understanding the world that Quaker doctrine considered incompatible with right religious practice. The community denounced the almanac. Leeds was put in the position of a man who had, in publishing something he considered a serious intellectual effort, managed to place himself outside the boundaries his community had drawn around acceptable thought. The Quaker leadership of the period was not known for half measures in such matters, and their denunciation of Leeds was not quiet. He eventually broke from the Society of Friends entirely, a rupture that carried real social weight in colonial New Jersey, where religious community and daily civic life were densely entangled. He did not disappear from colonial life. He continued publishing, he continued writing, but the label of diabolical content, once pressed against his name by the authority of a religious institution, does not come off easily in a community that regards diabolical content as a genuine and serious category of harm. There is something worth pausing on in the particular texture of that world. Colonial New Jersey, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, was not a place that treated the categories of witchcraft, demonic intervention, and supernatural curse as metaphors for social anxieties or as survivals of a primitive imagination that educated people had already moved past. These were understood as real and active forces in daily life. The theological frameworks that most colonial settlers carried with them from England and Europe had not separated the visible world from the invisible one. When something went wrong with a pregnancy, when a child was born different from the expected, when a family carried a pattern of misfortune that seemed too persistent to be ordinary luck, the available vocabulary for making sense of those things included the language of curse and demonic influence as naturally as it included the language of illness or accident. This is not a worldview that requires condescension to understand. It is a worldview in which the invisible and the visible were treated as continuous, and in which the idea of a cursed birth, a child delivered with some mark of otherworldly origin, was not a figure of speech. It was a category of event that a person might genuinely record in a letter and discuss with a neighbor and take seriously as a piece of information about the world. It was into this world that the story of Mother Leeds entered. The most widely circulated origin account of the Jersey Devil holds that a woman, known by that name, pregnant for the 13th time in the early 18th century, made a declaration in a moment of exhaustion or desperation that the devil could take this child. The circumstances most accounts describe are the kind that accumulate in households where poverty and repeated childbearing and the ordinary difficulties of colonial life have been wearing for a long time. When the child was born, the story goes, it did not remain a child. It transformed in the room where it was delivered into something else entirely, something with wings and a long neck and feet that were not human feet and a sound that was not a human sound. And then it left. It went up the chimney and out into the night and into the pine barrens which lay just there at the edge of the settled world, available to receive it. The name of the woman in this story, Mother Leeds, has never been attached with certainty to a specific documented historical person. The research record contains no verified individual, no baptismal record, no colonial census entry, no letter in a contemporary hand that confirms a particular woman by that name in that role. What the record contains is the story itself, spreading and persisting across generations, accruing details and variants, told in communities that had reasons for telling it. The Leeds family connection is real. The controversy around Daniel Leeds is documented. The cultural conditions that made a story about a cursed Leeds birth legible and resonant to its original audience are historically traceable. But the woman at the center of the origin story remains what she has perhaps always been, a narrative figure, specific enough to feel like a memory and general enough to absorb many different tellers' adjustments over time. What the Leeds family connection gave the story was a specific kind of gravity. Daniel Leeds had been publicly named by a religious community with real social authority as a person who had engaged with diabolical content. His son Titan Leeds continued the almanac business and acquired his own complications of reputation, in part through his involvement in a public quarrel with the most widely read colonial American writer of the period. Benjamin Franklin, operating his printing press in Philadelphia, was in direct market competition with Titan Leeds in the almanac trade, and he approached that competition with the specific cheerful aggression that characterized his relationship to most contests. In his Poor Richard's Almanac, Franklin mockingly predicted Titan Leeds's death, and then, when Leeds objected and continued very much alive, maintained the joke across multiple subsequent editions, insisting in print that the Titan Leeds who had written to complain could not possibly be the real Titan Leeds, since the real one had died on the date Franklin had named. It is easy to read this as simply a publishing rivalry conducted with wit and a certain amount of glee, which it partly was. Franklin was genuinely funny in print, and the Titan Leeds sequence is among his better extended jokes. But the joke worked in part because it drew on something that already existed in the cultural landscape, a sense of the Leeds family as figures associated with the questionable, the diabolical, the reputation that had been accumulating since Daniel's almanac controversy. Franklin did not create that association. He played on it, added to it, gave it another coat of paint that would last, the portrait of the Leeds family, as figures connected in some cultural way to the disreputable, and the shadowed was already there. Franklin's jokes made it more vivid and more widely distributed. The almanac rivalry became part of the sediment that the Jersey Devil legend would eventually be built on. A colonial household near the Pine Barrens on a winter night in the early 18th century would have been a place of particular textures and sounds, the fire in the hearth doing most of the work of both heat and light. The shutters closed against the cold and against whatever moved in the dark outside the door. Though the dark outside the door in pine country was a very specific kind of dark, flat and wide and held by trees that did not lose their needles in winter, so that even in January the interior of the pines was not bare. Through the shutters, if the wind was up, A person might hear the pines moving, the particular low continuous sound of a large body of coniferous forest in motion. This was the acoustic backdrop against which stories about the Leeds Devil were told. Not as entertainment in the way a campfire story is entertainment, with the understood contract that the listeners know the story is not real, told as information, as something worth knowing about, as a piece of local knowledge that belonged to the category of things a careful person kept in mind when moving through particular parts of the landscape after dark. The creature that the story described had a consistent shape across most of its early tellings, something roughly the size of a large dog, or perhaps larger, with a horse-shaped or goat-shaped head on a long neck, wings like a bat, hind legs longer than the forelegs, giving it an unusual posture, a pointed tail, feet that left a mark in soft ground or snow that was later described as neither quite human nor quite animal, with a distinctive number of toes and a particular spacing that witnesses across generations would claim to recognize. And a sound. This detail appears in account after account, a sound described as a shriek, very loud, and unlike anything the witness had heard from any animal they knew. This last quality is one of the story's most persistent features. Not just unusual, but categorically unlike known sounds. The creature always announces itself in a register that existing categories of sound cannot quite hold. The name under which this creature was known in its early decades was the Leeds Devil. The geographic reference came later as the legend spread beyond the specific communities where the Leeds family connection was a piece of living local memory. In those original communities, the creature was tied to a specific family, a specific controversy, a specific set of events, or events understood as events that had happened in a known place at a known if approximate time. The Leeds Devil was a local figure, in the way that local legends are local, attached to a particular piece of ground, known by people who lived near that piece of ground, and carrying a set of meanings that were legible to people embedded in that particular social and religious world. The transition from Leeds Devil to Jersey Devil happened across a long middle period in which the legend was not especially prominent in print, but remained active in oral tradition within Pine Barrens communities and in the broader culture of South Jersey. These things move in ways that leave few clean records. A story told at a kitchen table on a winter evening does not generate an archive. A name used in conversation by people who all already know what it refers to does not need to be explained in writing. The Jersey Devil, in this middle period, was the kind of figure that exists in the texture of a place without necessarily breaking the surface of formal documentation, known, assumed, referenced, but not especially examined. Then came January 1909. What happened in that month across towns throughout South Jersey represents one of the better documented episodes of collective sighting in American folklore history, not because the documentation is scientifically rigorous, but because regional newspapers were by that point well established, competitive, and deeply interested in precisely this kind of story. Woodbury, Burlington, Collingswood, Haddonfield, and many other communities across South Jersey, in the span of a single week, reported a wave of encounters, tracks, sounds, and visual sightings that became for that brief period the dominant story in regional and eventually national press coverage. What the newspapers called the creature varied slightly from outlet to outlet in the earliest days of that January week, but the process of standardization was rapid. Journalism of that period operated with strong competitive pressures and the particular need in a developing wire service environment to give shared stories, shared names. By the time the week was over and the coverage had been compiled and reprinted and commented on across dozens of regional papers. The name Jersey Devil had settled into common use in a way it had not quite before. The older Leeds family connection was not erased. It was sometimes mentioned as historical background, but the creature was now identified primarily with the geography rather than the genealogy. Jersey Devil, the devil of the whole state, the creature of the pines in their entirety, not the creature of one family's cursed history. There is something worth noticing about what that shift did to the legend. A creature attached to a specific family is, in an important sense, a creature with a specific origin story that can be interrogated, challenged, or set aside as the family's reputation changes or the original controversy fades. A creature attached to a landscape is something else. Landscapes persist differently than reputations. The Pine Barrens were there before the Leeds family, and they remained after the Leeds family connection became historical background rather than living context. By becoming the Jersey Devil rather than the Leeds Devil, the creature attached itself to something that was not going anywhere, 1,000,000 acres of pitch pine and cedar swamp and dark running water that had its own deep continuity and its own quality of being somewhat outside the ordinary settled world. The 1909 sighting wave was not a uniform event. It included reports from people who claimed to have seen the creature clearly, at close range, in good light, and could describe it in detail. It included reports of tracks found in snow and in mud, tracks that the finders often described as unlike any animal they could name. It included reports of strange sounds heard at night by people who did not see anything but felt, on the basis of the sound alone, that something unusual was in the area. Schools closed, pauses organized. A general atmosphere of excited attention settled over South Jersey for the duration of the week in a way that itself became part of the story, not just what people saw, but the fact that so many people were looking and talking about what they were looking for, and influencing each other's expectations in the particular way that happens when a community becomes focused on a shared question. In that kind of collective moment, it is impossible to separate cleanly the things that would have been reported, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention, from the things that were reported, because everyone was paying attention. A sound heard on an ordinary night might not have been mentioned to a neighbor, heard during a week when the local paper had a story about the Jersey Devil on the front page. The same sound becomes worth reporting. Tracks that might have been examined and set aside as probably from a known animal become more ambiguous when the category of unexplained tracks has been activated in a person's mind by recent reading. This is not to say that all the reports were misperceptions or that nothing unusual was in the landscape that week. It is to say that what people see and what they report are never entirely separable from the context in which the seeing and reporting happen. The 1909 wave is interesting as an episode, not despite this complication, but partly because of it. The newspapers of January 1909 were printed in the dense stacked typeface of early 20th century regional journalism, the columns narrow and close, the headlines competing for attention across a crowded page. The name Jersey Devil appeared in those columns, surrounded by the names of specific streets, specific neighborhoods, specific individuals willing to give their names to a reporter, anchoring the legend to a fabric of ordinary documented civic life. This is part of what made the 1909 wave different from the oral tradition that preceded it. The legend had entered the record in a form that could be cited, preserved, reprinted. The Leeds family connection was still there for anyone who wanted to look back past 1909 into the older layers of the story. But the creature itself had now acquired a documented public life that was larger than any single family's history, and that documentation would persist in newspaper archives long after the specific social context of that January week had faded. The story of Daniel Leeds and his 1687 almanac. In one reading, the story of a man who made a professional and intellectual choice that put him in conflict with his religious community, and who paid a social price for that conflict that then, through the strange logic of legend formation, attached supernatural weight to his family's name for generations afterward. Leeds was not, by the historical record that exists, a person who trafficked in anything genuinely diabolical. He was a colonial intellectual with eclectic reading habits and a willingness to publish content his community found objectionable. The astrological material in his almanac, which the Quaker leadership treated as evidence of dangerous heresy, was not unusual in the broader world of 17th century European publishing. It was unusual in the specific social context of the Philadelphia Quaker community, where the lines around acceptable engagement with non-Quaker intellectual traditions were drawn more strictly than in many other communities of the period. That specificity matters. The controversy that eventually fed into the Jersey Devil legend was not a controversy about whether Daniel Leeds was doing something that most people in the Atlantic world would have found alarming. It was a controversy within a particular religious community with particular standards, and it became a controversy with lasting consequences because that community had the social authority to make its denunciation stick. Daniel Leeds went from being a Quaker almanac publisher to being a man publicly branded within his community as someone who had engaged with diabolical material. That branding, applied by people with the authority to make it mean something, became part of what was available to later generations when they needed a story to tell about where the creature came from. The social logic of the origin story, whatever its relationship to actual historical events, was entirely coherent within the worldview that produced it. A man associates himself with diabolical content. His family acquires a reputation connected to that association. A woman in that family, at a moment of genuine desperation, makes a declaration that invites the devil's involvement in a birth. The result is a creature that escapes into the wilderness. Each step follows from the last in a way that would have seemed not just plausible, but almost inevitable to an audience that understood curses as real divine judgment as active, and the wilderness at the edge of the settled world as a place where things not quite human might find purchase. The Pine Barrens, with their particular quality of enclosure and their distance from the main centers of colonial settlement, were exactly the right landscape to receive such a creature. Wild enough to be believable as a habitat, close enough to be present, dark enough to hold a secret. Titan Leeds' role in the story is quieter than his father's, and mostly mediated through someone else's pen. Franklin's almanac jokes at Titan's expense were not malicious in the way of a genuine attack. They were the kind of comic aggression that colonial print culture permitted between market competitors dressed as satire, and they carried the lightness of something not meant to be taken fully seriously. But they contributed to a portrait. A family whose patriarch had been branded with the diabolical, whose next generation was being publicly mocked in the most widely read publication in the colonies as either dead and in denial about it, or fraudulently claiming to be the person they were. This was a family whose name carried a particular kind of strangeness in the cultural landscape. Strangeness of that kind, attached to a family name for long enough, becomes available to legend in a way that clean reputations are not. The strangeness was there when the legend needed it. The movement from Leeds Devil to Jersey Devil across the 18th and 19th centuries was gradual enough that no single moment of renaming can be identified. Names in oral tradition shift by accumulation rather than by decision. A teller who is slightly unclear on the lead's connection uses a more general term. A listener carries that more general term to the next community. A newspaper in 1909, covering events from many different towns and needing a single name that all of its readers will recognize, reaches for the most geographically comprehensive version, and then that version, printed in hundreds of copies and preserved in archives, becomes the standard. The Leeds family connection does not disappear. It retreats. It becomes historical background, available to the curious, but no longer the first thing most people mean when they use the name. What the 1909 newspapers were doing in standardizing that name was formalizing something that had already been happening informally for a long time. The creature had been outgrowing its specific genealogical origin for generations. By the time the January sightings were reported, the Jersey Devil was already a piece of South Jersey geography as much as a piece of Leeds family history. The 1909 wave did not create the legend. It documented and amplified a legend that was already mature, already stable in its basic outlines, already attached to the landscape in the way that durable folklore attaches, not just to a place, but to the particular quality of a place, the specific combination of ecological conditions and human experience that makes a piece of ground feel like somewhere a story like this could happen. The name Jersey Devil, settling into the columns of those regional newspapers in January 1909, was by that point the name of something that had traveled a considerable distance from the writing table where Daniel Leeds prepared his almanac in 1687. The almanac controversy was there at the beginning. The Quaker denunciation was there. The Benjamin Franklin jokes were there. The accumulated oral tradition of Pine Barrens communities was there. The particular worldview that made a cursed birth and a creature escaping into the wilderness feel like a coherent piece of information about the world, that was there too, in somewhat diluted form, still available as the cultural substrate on which the 1909 wave of sightings could make sense to the people who reported and read about them. Legends do not grow from nothing. They grow from something specific, a controversy, a family, a religious conflict, a landscape, and then they slowly separate from that specific origin as they are carried farther in time and space from the people and events that first gave them shape. The Leeds family gave the Jersey Devil legend its first form and its original name. The Pine Barrens gave it a home. The colonial worldview gave it cultural legibility. The competing almanac publishers of 18th century Philadelphia gave it a particular social texture. The regional newspapers of January 1909 gave it a name that would last. All of these things are still there in the legend. If the question is where it came from, they have simply been absorbed, the way the tannins of fallen leaves are absorbed into the dark water of a pine barren stream, present in what the water is, no longer visible as individual leaves, carrying the dissolved memory of everything that fell into them upstream, moving slowly forward and leaving the source further and further behind. The creature, as it appears most consistently across 200 years of accounts, begins at the ground. The feet are clawed and narrow, leaving a three-toed impression in soft ground that witnesses and investigators over many decades have returned to again and again as the most frequently discovered physical evidence. The legs are long at the rear and shorter at the front, giving the body a hunched forward-leaning posture in the descriptions of those who claim to have seen it standing still. The wings fold against the body at rest and spread to a span variously estimated between 2 and 6 feet, depending on the account, membranous and dark, like those of a bat, scaled to a size no bat has ever reached. The neck is long. The head, in the most frequently cited version of the description, is shaped like a horse's head, narrow and elongated, carried at the end of that long neck at an angle that several witnesses across different decades and different towns have described with the same word. Wrong. The tail is pointed. The overall impression in most accounts is of a creature assembled from parts that belong to recognizable animals, but that do not belong together, standing somewhere between 4 and 5 feet tall on the ground, and capable in the air of moving faster than any bird of similar size ought to move. This description did not appear fully formed at a single moment. It accumulated across accounts separated by decades and geography, each new report borrowing from the last and adding something particular to the witness. A detail would surface in one account, travel through newspaper coverage, and appear again slightly modified in the next cluster of sightings, the way descriptions of any repeatedly reported thing tend to converge over time around a shared image. What is notable is how stable the core of the description remained. The clawed feet, the wings, the horse-shaped head, the shriek, those 4 elements appear in accounts separated by more than a century, with a consistency that, whatever its source, is at least interesting to observe. The sound is worth pausing on before the sightings themselves. Across accounts from the 18th century through the 20th, the call associated with the creature is described not as a roar or a howl, but as a shriek or a scream, and almost universally as unlike any known animal sound. Witnesses reach for comparisons and find none that satisfy them. Some describe it as a woman screaming at a distance, a description that creates its own particular problem, since such a sound in the dark would send most people inside before they could observe its source clearly. Others describe it as a high, piercing mechanical noise, or a sound that seemed to come from many directions at once, or a cry that started on one pitch and slid to another in a way that suggested neither bird nor mammal by any category the listener could place. The sound precedes most visual sightings in the accounts. It arrives before the creature does, or lingers after it has gone, and the witnesses who report hearing it without ever seeing anything are considerably more numerous than those who report seeing anything at all. The winter week of January 16 through 23, 1909, is by some distance the most densely documented episode in the record of Jersey Devil sightings, and it is worth spending some time inside it, because the texture of that week reveals something about how a widespread community encounter with a shared legend actually moves through ordinary life. The accounts began arriving at newspaper offices in towns across southern New Jersey in the middle of that week, first as individual letters and then as clusters that the papers began printing together under headers that grew larger with each edition. Woodbury, Burlington, Collingswood, Haddonfield, Camden, Mount Holly. The geography of the sightings spread outward from the pine barrens in every direction, reaching communities that had no particular relationship to the interior forest, and little obvious reason to be thinking about a creature associated primarily with that landscape. The accounts shared the standard description in its broad outlines, and diverged considerably in their particulars, which is consistent with how independent reports of a shared cultural image tend to distribute themselves across a population. What was reported varied by witness. Some people describe seeing the creature directly, usually at night, usually at the edge of a yard or a field or a road, for a duration of seconds. Some described hearing the shriek without seeing anything. Some, perhaps the largest number, described finding tracks in the snow the following morning, a 3-toed impression pressed into fresh fallen snow, continuing in a line across open ground, crossing fences and rooftops in a pattern that seemed to indicate the maker had moved in a straight line regardless of obstacles, the way a flying animal might if it were touching down intermittently rather than walking. These track reports were among the most widely reproduced in the press, partly because tracks are physical evidence that persists after the event, available for examination and measurement and comparison in a way that a glimpse in the dark is not. Schools in some towns along the Delaware River closed for portions of that week, and local posses organized in at least one community to search the surrounding fields and woodlands. A fire company in one South Jersey town reportedly turned its hose on the creature when it appeared near the firehouse, an account that stretches the credulity without leaving any particular trace of verification. The newspapers handled the material with varying degrees of seriousness. Some editors printed the accounts with a raised eyebrow implicit in the phrasing. Others ran them as straight news. By the end of the week, the volume of reported sightings from across the state had given the event a quality that individual accounts lacked. It had become regional, encompassing communities too distant and too socially disconnected from one another for the accounts to be easily attributed to a single shared source. The word Jersey Devil, rather than Leeds Devil, appears in the newspaper coverage of that week with notable regularity. The older name had attached the creature to a specific family and a specific colonial controversy. The newer name attached it to a place. In the space of a single week of dense press coverage, the legend was geographically expanded and in some sense democratized, made available to anyone who lived within the state's borders rather than belonging particularly to the communities around the pines. That shift had been gradual before 1909. After that week, the name Jersey Devil was effectively fixed. Joseph Bonaparte did not think of himself as a South Jersey curiosity when he arrived in Bordentown in 1816, which is perhaps understandable given that he had recently been King of Spain, King of Naples, and the older brother of Napoleon. He spent more than 2 decades at his Bordentown estate, which he developed into one of the more elaborate private properties in early 19th century America, with gardens, a private lake, and extensive wooded grounds that he used for hunting. He was a familiar figure in the region by the standards of the time, known to local residents, and occasionally visited by American political figures who found his proximity to Philadelphia convenient, and his conversation, by several accounts, worth the journey. The story connecting him to the Jersey Devil belongs to local tradition rather than to any document Bonaparte himself produced. What the tradition holds is that during a hunting excursion on his estate, Bonaparte encountered tracks in the snow that he could not identify, and that at some point during or after that excursion, he saw something in the air or at the edge of the tree line that he could not account for by any animal he had encountered in Europe or during his time in America. He reportedly described the encounter to neighbors who incorporated it into the developing body of local knowledge about the creature. This account has been repeated in regional histories and collections of Jersey Devil lore with a kind of fond confidence that the underlying sourcing does not quite support. There is no contemporary letter, diary entry, or newspaper account that records Bonaparte's own description of the experience. What there is instead is the persistent tradition of the story itself, circulating in the region from the early 19th century onward, gaining detail and solidity through repetition the way local traditions do. The interest of the story lies not primarily in whether it happened as described, but in the fact that a former European king hunting on his American estate became, within the geography of South Jersey legend, simply another witness. The creature's legend apparently had room for him. Stephen Decatur's connection to the Jersey Devil legend runs through the Hanover Iron Works, one of several ironworking operations that made the Pine Barrens a center of industrial production during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Decatur, one of the more celebrated naval officers of the early American Republic, was reportedly stationed at or visiting the works for the purpose of testing ammunition, the ironworks having supplied cannonballs for American military use. The story, as it exists in local tradition, holds that during a period of artillery testing at the site, Decatur and others present observed a large winged creature crossing the open ground of the testing range, and that Decatur fired on it, and that the cannonball passed through the creature's wing without causing it any apparent distress or disruption of its flight, after which it continued on its way and disappeared beyond the tree line. The story is good on its own terms. It has a clear setting. It has a satisfying internal logic, given that a creature said to be unaccountable by ordinary means would be equally unaccountable to ordnance. It places a nationally known figure in the position of witness, which lends it a particular weight in the retelling. And it is, by the standards of the research record, a piece of folklore rather than a documented historical event. No contemporary account from Decatur himself, or from any other individual present at the Hanover, works on the relevant occasion has been produced to support it. It circulates in the same category as the Bonaparte story, a tradition with a named, credible protagonist attached to a real place and a real period that has traveled through regional legend without generating the kind of primary documentation that would allow it to be confirmed. Both stories do something interesting together. They suggest that the Jersey Devil legend, at a fairly early stage in its development, was already attracting prominent witnesses. The creature was not only encountered by rural residents of the Pine Barrens interior, it was encountered according to tradition by a deposed European king and a celebrated American naval hero. Whatever else those additions to the legend represent, they represent a kind of social expansion. The creature's territory in the cultural imagination was becoming as large as the landscape it supposedly inhabited. The sighting record did not end with the 19th century in the great newspaper week of January 1909. It continued moving through the 20th century in smaller episodes, localized clusters that erupted briefly in a particular community and then subsided, leaving behind a brief trail of local newspaper coverage and personal accounts that circulated among the people who lived nearby. August 1951 brought one such cluster to Gibbstown, New Jersey, a community in Gloucester County situated at some distance from the Pine Barrens proper, but within the zone of cultural landscape that the legend had occupied since 1909. A group of children reported encountering a large unidentified creature near their neighborhood, using terms that fell within the range of the standard Jersey Devil description. The account was specific in the way children's accounts often are: a particular location, a particular quality of movement, a particular quality of sound. Local newspapers covered the report, and the coverage generated additional accounts from adults in the surrounding area over the following weeks, the familiar ripple effect of a sighting cluster. The Gibbstown accounts share a feature with many mid-century Jersey Devil reports. They occur at the margins rather than in the interior, not in the cedar swamps of the Pinelands core, but at the edge of a neighborhood, in the brushy zone between the domestic and the wild, in the kind of in-between place that appears repeatedly in accounts of the creature, regardless of the decade. The Jersey Devil in 20th century sightings is consistently a creature of thresholds, seen at the edge of a yard, at the tree line, at the far end of a field, in the moment before it disappears, rather than in the full plain light of open ground. This is, on one reading, simply what would be expected of any shy large animal caught at the edge of human habitation. On another reading, it is what would be expected of a creature that exists most fully in the moment of perception, at the exact point where the familiar ends and the unexplained begins. There is a quality to the accumulated sighting record that is easier to feel than to describe precisely. Taken individually, each account is modest, a glimpse in poor light, tracks in snow that melted before they could be properly examined, a sound unlike any known animal, heard once and then not again. The Bonaparte tradition and the Decatur story, which carry more cultural weight than most, are also the ones most clearly located in the category of legend rather than documented event. The 1909 week of sightings is the closest thing the record has to a mass observation event, and even there, the reports are distributed, inconsistent in their particulars, and largely dependent on witness testimony gathered hours or days after the fact. And yet the accumulation is not nothing. More than 200 years of accounts from a specific geographic region, involving witnesses from different social backgrounds and different relationships to the legend, producing descriptions that share a recognizable core without being identical, is at minimum an interesting cultural fact. It describes a community that has been in sustained imaginative relationship with a particular creature for a very long time. Whether the creature itself is the explanation for that relationship, or whether the relationship is the explanation for the creature, is a question the record does not resolve, and the record is honest enough not to pretend otherwise. What the accounts share most consistently is a quality of genuine conviction in the witness. The people who report encountering the Jersey Devil are not, in the majority of cases, presenting themselves as entertainers or pranksters or individuals seeking attention. They are presenting themselves as people who saw or heard something they could not account for and who are reporting it as accurately as they can. That accuracy may be imperfect. Memory is selective. Perception under uncertain conditions is unreliable. A sound heard in darkness through a closed window on a January night is not the same thing as a sound heard clearly in open air in good light. The limitations of human perception as a recording instrument are well understood, but the witnesses do not, in general, seem to know what they are looking for, and then find it. They seem, more often, to encounter something unexpected and then reach for the nearest cultural template available to describe it. The nearest cultural template in southern New Jersey for the better part of 3 centuries has been the Jersey Devil. The physical geography of the encounter sites is worth noting as a pattern across the sightings. The cedar swamps in the pinelands interior, where the canopy closes overhead and the water runs dark and the ground is soft enough to hold an impression, are the original habitat of the legend, the territory most closely associated with the creature in the oldest accounts. But the 1909 cluster moved well outside that territory, into towns with brick streets and firehouse doors and schoolrooms that could be latched closed against whatever was outside. The Gibbstown sightings of 1951 occurred in a community that in the 1950s was a working-class neighborhood of modest houses with yards that backed up to undeveloped margins. These are not wild places in any strict ecological sense. They are ordinary human settlements at the edge of unmanaged land, which is to say, they are most of New Jersey, most of the time. The creature's ability to appear at such margins, rather than retreating to the deep interior, is one of the things that makes the legend geographically flexible. It does not require the listener or the witness to be particularly far from ordinary life. The edge of the yard is close enough, the far end of the school field, the stretch of road between 2 towns, where the streetlights stop and the pines come close. The legend, in this way, follows people wherever there is a margin near them, and in New Jersey there are margins everywhere, even now. The Cedar Barrens interior remains the landscape most closely identified with the creature, and the association has a logic to it that does not depend entirely on legend. The Pineland's interior is genuinely disorienting to people unfamiliar with it. The trees repeat. The sandy tracks through the vegetation look similar for miles. The light under the pine canopy on an overcast day is flat and directionless. The cedar swamps absorb sound in ways that make distance difficult to judge. Sounds heard in the swamp interior carry and shift depending on atmospheric conditions, and the range of sounds produced by the resident wildlife, from the calling of owls to the movements of deer, through dense vegetation to the various calls of animals active at night, covers a wide register. Someone moving through that interior in poor light, unfamiliar with its acoustic properties, would have legitimate difficulty identifying the sources of what they heard. This does not explain the Jersey Devil. It does not need to. What it does is place the legend back inside the landscape that produced it, where it sits comfortably and makes a certain kind of sense. The Pinelands are a place where the unfamiliar can feel genuinely present, even in the absence of any particular reason. The landscape has a quality of inhabited depth that precedes any legend attached to it, and that would remain if every story were removed. The creature belongs there, not because it necessarily exists there, but because the landscape is the kind of place where the question of existence itself feels more open than it does elsewhere. The track reports deserve a closer look before moving on. The January 1909 tracks were described in multiple accounts as a series of three-toed impressions running in a nearly straight line across surfaces that an ordinary walking animal would not navigate in a straight line, across the tops of fence rails, across snow-covered rooftops, across open fields with no indication of where the trail began or ended, as if whatever made it had descended from the air, moved across the surface for a stretch, and then ascended again. This pattern was consistent across accounts from different towns, reported independently by individuals who had no obvious contact with one another before the coverage appeared in print. Several explanations have been offered for the 1909 tracks over the years. A hoax coordinated across multiple communities is logistically complicated, though not impossible, given the distances involved. Misidentified animal tracks distorted by melting or drifting snow are plausible in individual cases, less so as an explanation for accounts spread across an entire region. A single individual or small group traveling by night and leaving impressions across a wide area as a deliberate act of mischief is a theory that has been raised but never confirmed. The tracks were examined by some people at the time, reported in the press, and then melted with the snow, leaving nothing to examine afterward. The record stops where the evidence stops, and the question of what made those tracks is one the record cannot answer. There were also, across the broader sighting history, reports of marks on livestock and property attributed to the creature, scratched fence posts, distressed farm animals with no clear cause identified, missing poultry. These reports are harder to evaluate than the track accounts because they do not require the presence of any particular creature, only the absence of an obvious conventional explanation. And in agricultural communities, there are many reasons for poultry to go missing and fences to be damaged that have nothing to do with anything unusual. The reports accumulate in the record without resolving into pattern, the way background noise accumulates in a long data set without resolving into signal. The shriek remains the most persistently reported element of the legend, and the one most resistant to easy explanation. Multiple species resident in or near the Pine Barrens produce sounds that under certain conditions and at certain distances could be experienced as unfamiliar or alarming by a listener who did not recognize them. The eastern screech owl produces a long descending whinny that at night and at a distance has surprised more than one person unfamiliar with it. The red fox produces a range of calls, including a sharp, high bark that some listeners find distinctly unsettling. Fisher cats present in some adjacent habitats are documented to produce piercing screams. Deer in distress, herons disturbed from roosting, even the acoustic distortions produced by dense vegetation and variable atmospheric conditions can transform familiar sounds into temporarily unrecognizable ones. None of these explains all the shriek reports. Some are probably explained by individual species in specific circumstances. Others are harder to account for and remain simply as reports. This person, in this place, in this season, heard something they could not identify, and the identification they offered was the one their cultural landscape provided. The shriek persists in the legend because it is the most immediate and least assailable element of the encounter. A glimpse in poor light can be revised upon reflection. A track in snow can be re-examined and reinterpreted. A sound heard at close range in an otherwise quiet place makes an impression that revision finds more resistant. The summer of 1951 in Gibbstown moved through its ordinary weeks after the initial reports. The local newspapers covered the cluster for a few weeks and then moved on to other material. The children who had reported the encounter went back inside their houses, and then, over the following days, returned to ordinary summer routines. The brush margin at the edge of the yard resumed whatever sounds it normally produced in late summer. The insects and birds and small movements of wind through leaves that constitute the background of any undeveloped margin in late August in New Jersey. The adults who had added their own accounts to the cluster in the weeks following the initial reports returned to work and to the ordinary rhythms of a working-class community in a post-war decade. The legend did not resolve in Gibbstown in the summer of 1951. It simply stopped generating new events and returned to the condition it occupies between clusters: present but quiet, available but not active, belonging to the regional landscape the way any long-established local tradition belongs to its place. Someone in Gibbstown who had been a child in the summer of 1951 would spend the following decades carrying the memory of that afternoon. At the brush margin, the quality of the light, the specific sound or movement or shape that had sent the group of them running back toward the houses. The memory would not become more explicable with time. It would simply become part of the interior geography of that particular life, filed alongside other vivid and unexplained experiences in a category that does not have a clean label, but that most people who carry such memories understand instinctively. This is how the legend persists through individual lives, rather than through newspaper coverage. The great public events in the sighting record, the 1909 week with its closed schools and organized pauses and dense newspaper columns, are the visible surface of something more distributed and more intimate. Under that surface runs a much longer and quieter record of individual encounters. A farmer who saw something at the edge of his back field on an October evening in 1934 and mentioned it once to his wife and never brought it up again. A woman driving a rural road through the pines in the 1960s who slowed because something large crossed in her headlights and was gone before she could hold it in focus. A pair of hunters resting at the edge of a cedar swamp on a November morning in some undocumented year who heard from somewhere back in the trees a sound neither of them had heard before, and who looked at each other without speaking and then gathered their gear and walked back out of the swamp toward the road. Those encounters do not enter the newspaper record. They are not verified by anyone, and they are carried quietly inside the people who had them shared occasionally with family members or close friends, and passed forward into the life of the legend not as documented events, but as the ambient warmth that keeps a tradition alive between its public episodes. The Jersey Devil lives in those quiet accounts at least as much as it lives in the weeks of mass sightings, possibly more. The landscape itself contributes to the continuity in a way that is worth naming directly. The Pine Barrens remain, in the first decades of the 21st century, a landscape genuinely unlike anything immediately adjacent to it. The transition from suburban southern New Jersey into the interior of the Pinlands is still a transition into something that feels different in quality as well as character. The trees thin and regularize. The air carries that faint resinous sharpness. The human density drops. The sounds change. Anyone who makes that transition at night, driving a two-lane road into the interior with no particular destination, will understand why the legend is located here rather than somewhere else. The place lends itself to the question of what moves through it that has not been cataloged and named. It is that kind of place. It has always been that kind of place. The creature described across 200 years of accounts has the quality of something designed by a landscape rather than observed within it, assembled from the logic of a place that has always sat slightly outside ordinary categories. Too acidic to farm easily, too flat to read clearly, too quiet to dismiss, and too particular to absorb into the surrounding region without remainder. A horse head on a bat-winged body with a pointed tail and a shriek unlike anything known is not a random assortment of features. It is, in a way, the correct creature for this particular place. All the familiar elements present, but arranged in a way that refuses to resolve into anything comfortable, anything that can be placed and moved past. The legend does not ask to be resolved. It asks only to be taken seriously as a thing that has happened to people in a specific place over a very long time, and that continues to happen in the quiet way that legends continue after their most visible episodes have passed into history. The children in Gibbstown went back inside on that August afternoon in 1951, and the ordinary sounds of a summer day resumed around the brushy yard margin where they had been standing. Cicadas, a distant car, the sound of a screen door somewhere down the block. The margin itself was still and ordinary looking, as margins usually are after whatever moved through them has moved on. The afternoon continued, the summer continued, the pines continued, a short distance away, in the direction they had always been, going quietly about their long business of holding water and producing cones and running dark streams toward the deep ground, full of whatever they have always been full of, unresolved and complete in themselves. A family moving through the interior of the Pine Barrens in the early years of the 20th century would have known the path between two cedar-edged streams, not by any sign or marker, but by the particular arrangement of the pitch pines along its margins. By the way, the ground changed underfoot from firm white sand to the yielding dark softness of accumulated peat by the sound the wind made differently in one stand of trees than in another a quarter-mile east. The oldest member of such a group would pause at intervals, not from tiredness, but from the habit of attention, near the edge of a boggy clearing, where the ground grew wetter and the ordinary pitch pines gave way to something lower and more tangled. A hand would extend toward a small plant growing close to the waterlogged earth, and a name would come out of it, a name that existed nowhere else, in no botanical dictionary and no county record, a name that had been given in that region by people who needed to speak about the plant and had simply made the word for it themselves. The plant was known, The name was known. The knowledge moved through families rather than through institutions, and it had done so for long enough that no one could say with confidence where it had started. That quality of knowledge, specific, local, transmitted in the course of ordinary movement through a particular landscape, is one of the most important things about the communities that have lived inside the Pine Barrens for generations. It is the kind of knowledge that does not travel well. It resists summary. It becomes thinner when carried out of the terrain it was made for, and it becomes richer the more closely it is held to the ground that produced it. The people who carried it were not unusual in this regard. People have always known their home landscapes in ways that outsiders found difficult to see or to credit. But in the Pine Barrens, that local knowledge was so deep, and the outsider misreading of it so persistent and so consequential, that the history of the two things together, the knowledge and its misreading, is worth holding carefully. The word piney carries a weight of history that its current use does not always make visible. It appeared in common use as an outsider designation no later than the middle of the 19th century, applied by people living at the edges of the Pine region to those living within it, carrying with it the full set of assumptions that outsiders have often applied to communities living in landscapes considered inhospitable or marginal. It implied poverty, it implied isolation, it implied, in the way that such terms generally do, a judgment about intelligence and capability that was never earned by evidence and was always grounded in nothing more substantial than unfamiliarity. To live in the pines, in the view that produced the term, was to have failed to leave them rather than to have chosen to remain, to have found within them a livelihood and a set of relationships with the land that were neither primitive nor accidental, but the product of considerable and carefully maintained skill. In the decades since, and with a gradual shift that has no single starting point and no clean completion, many families with long roots in the Pine Barrens have taken the word back and held it differently. Piney, in the mouths of those families, is a statement of belonging rather than a verdict on its absence. It points toward continuity, toward the long, unbroken thread of residence in a landscape that the rest of the state consistently underestimated. The material life of those communities was built on what the Pine Barrens actually contained, rather than on what outside observers thought it lacked. The streams and swamps of the Pinelands had for centuries before the first European settlements been producing a particular kind of iron ore, forming slowly in the acidic, tannin-dark water wherever the right chemical conditions held. It was not ore in the sense of a hard seam buried in rock. It accumulated at the edges of streams and in the beds of boggy shallows, soft and dark, gathered by hand or with simple tools and carried to the furnaces that would smelt it down. The furnaces at Batstow, at Atcham, at Etna, and other sites drew workers into the interior of the pines and built settlements around themselves, not the isolated, scattered communities that outsiders imagined, but organized places of work, with housing and provisioning, and the whole social structure that sustained industrial labor. During the years of the Revolutionary War, the ironworks of the Pine Barrens supplied shot and cannon shells to the Continental Army, making the interior of what might have seemed an empty and peripheral landscape into a significant node in the supply chain of a new nation's military campaign. The bog iron that made this possible was not a discovery of European settlers. The ore had been there as long as the streams had been acidic, and the understanding of what could be done with it had its own history before the furnaces were built. Batstow Village stands now in the summer trees above the Batstow River, its furnace cold, its ironmaster's house preserved, its mill pond still and reflective on a quiet morning. The work stopped in the 19th century as better iron sources and better transportation routes shifted production away from the pine barrens, and the forest moved back in around the edges of the settlement in the gradual, patient way that pine forests do. First the low scrub, then the young trees, then the slow closing of the canopy overhead. What remains is the outline of a working world that once mattered considerably and is now easy to walk through without fully registering the scale of what happened there. The stones of the furnace hold their shape. The river runs the same dark color it always did, the tannins unchanged since the bog iron was scooped from its banks, the water moving with the same unhurried intention toward the aquifer below. Beyond the iron trade, the communities of the Pine Barrens maintained livelihoods from charcoal production, from the harvesting of sphagnum moss, from cranberry cultivation in the low, wet portions of the landscape, from gathering and preparing the botanical materials that served as medicine for people living at distances from any trained physician. The knowledge underlying that last practice was not self-contained. It had been built over generations through a long, specific kind of contact with the Lenape people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, whose own botanical knowledge of the Pine Barrens and its surroundings was the product of a relationship with the land that preceded European settlement by thousands of years. What entered the practice of Pine Barrens healers through that contact was not a wholesale adoption of Lenape knowledge. The two traditions were distinct, shaped by different histories and different ways of understanding the relationship between people and plants, but something more like a gradual incorporation, a slow adding of particular preparations and particular uses of particular plants into a body of practice that also drew on European herbal traditions brought across the Atlantic. Sassafras root and bark, prepared in ways that varied from one healer to the next and from one decade to the next. Sphagnum moss, packed against wounds in the knowledge that the moss had properties that worked against infection in ways that could be observed even when they could not be explained. Yarrow, collected in the clearings where it grew and dried against the walls of small interiors that smelled of the pines outside the door. The knowledge lived in the preparation, and the preparation lived in the hands of specific people who had learned from other specific people, and behind those people stretched a chain of transmission that went back past any point that could be documented. A healer's shelves in a Pine Barrens household in the early years of the 20th century would have been modest and specific. Dried plant material in bundles, the fragrance of it mixing with wood smoke, and the sharp, faintly sweet smell of the pines that was always present wherever the windows were not sealed tight against winter cold. Small containers of prepared salves, each one the result of a process that was not written down, but that was known well enough to be reproduced when needed. Perhaps a few handwritten notes, not instructions but reminders, the name of a neighbor for whom a particular preparation had worked in a particular season, the name of a stream where the right plant grew most reliably. Nothing in that collection would have been recognized as medicine by a physician trained in the institutions of the period. All of it would have been recognized immediately by anyone who had grown up in those communities and had watched their parents or grandparents move through the same practical routines with the same practical ease. What happened to those communities in the early decades of the 20th century, and in particular during the years surrounding the First World War, is a piece of history that sits within the broader story of American eugenics, a movement whose scientific claims have been entirely discredited and whose social consequences were real and lasting and were felt acutely by people in the Pine Barrens. In 1913, a psychologist named Henry H. Goddard published a study called the Kallikak family, which presented itself as a careful genetic investigation of hereditary intelligence and which drew on fieldwork carried out in Pine Barrens communities by his research assistant, Elizabeth Kite. The argument of the study was that isolated rural communities, like those of the Pine Barrens, contained a hereditary population of feeble-minded people, the term of the period, used without self-consciousness in the study itself, and that this population represented a social problem best addressed through institutional control and sterilization. The study was taken seriously by educated people who should have known better. It was taught in universities. It influenced legislation. It was cited in a Supreme Court decision that upheld the forced sterilization of a woman named Carrie Buck in 1927, a decision that remained technically in force for decades and that rested on a scientific foundation that had never been sound. The methodological problems with the Kallikak study are not subtle. The fieldwork was conducted by someone who arrived in Pine Barrens communities with a predetermined set of categories and a willingness to classify the people she met according to those categories on the basis of brief observation. Elizabeth Kite was not a neutral observer applying rigorous standards. He was a person shaped by the theoretical commitments of the institution that had trained her, moving through a landscape whose actual social complexity and knowledge base her framework had already made invisible to her before she arrived. The photographs in the published study, which purported to show the degeneracy of the subjects, were later found to have been altered. The genealogical claims at the center of the argument were constructed from records that did not support the conclusions drawn from them, and the people who had been observed and classified in the fields and kitchens of the Pine Barrens were not the isolated, incapable figures the study described. They were people engaged in complex traditional economies, holding detailed knowledge of a specific landscape, maintaining social relationships and cultural practices that required exactly the qualities the study claimed they lacked. The stigma attached to pine communities by the Kallikak study and by the broader eugenics movement that amplified its conclusions persisted long after the science behind it had been abandoned. That is the particular quality of social stigma. It does not require its original justification to remain in circulation. None of this made the communities of the Pine Barrens disappear or fall silent. People continued to live there, to work the same landscapes, to carry the same practical knowledge forward through the same channels of family and neighborhood transmission that had always sustained it. The ironworks had closed, the charcoal trade had contracted, the economic landscape had shifted, as it always does, and the communities had adapted, as they always had, not by leaving or not in large numbers, but by finding the next livelihood available in the specific terrain they inhabited. Cranberry cultivation expanded in the low, wet areas where the soil and water conditions suited it. Blueberry farming became significant in the sandier upland sections. The gathering economy persisted alongside the agricultural one, and the botanical knowledge that had always been part of daily life in the pines continued to inform the way people moved through the woods and the bogs and the cedar-edged streams of the interior. Running through all of it, and not separable from any of it, was the creature. The Jersey Devil was not, for the people who had lived longest in the Pine Barrens, a tourist attraction or a piece of state branding or an emblem to be printed on sports team jerseys. It was something closer to a feature of the landscape, as local and as specific as the cedar swamp behind a particular farm, as the particular bend in a particular stream where the water ran coldest and clearest, as the stand of Atlantic white cedar that grew in close formation along the north-facing side of a low ridge a few miles from the nearest road. Older residents of Pine Barrens communities When asked about the creature by folklorists and researchers who came to record what they knew, often described it in those geographical terms. It lived somewhere particular. It had been seen near a specific swamp that everyone in the conversation knew by name. The story of an encounter was attached to a place and to a season and to a specific set of circumstances that made sense in the context of someone who moved through that landscape regularly. It was not in the telling a general phenomenon. It was a local one, belonging to a particular cedar swamp or a particular stretch of pine road, the way a family of herons might belong to a particular marsh. The folklorists who came to document this material were working in a tradition that understood such knowledge as worth preserving precisely because it was specific. Herbert Halpert, whose field work in New Jersey and the surrounding region produced recordings and transcriptions of traditional belief and narrative, recognized that the Jersey Devil story, as told by Pine Barrens residents, was not the same creature as the one appearing in newspaper accounts or in the souvenir shops of Atlantic City. The newspaper creature was generic, its description standardized across 100 accounts from 100 towns, its geography vague, its significance cultural in the broad sense. The creature that appeared in conversation on a Pine Barrens porch on a summer evening was something else, tied to specific memory, specific terrain, specific relationships between the person speaking and the landscape around them, embedded in a worldview in which the natural and the supernatural were not cleanly separate categories, but continuous dimensions of the same inhabited world. Mary Hufford's work, conducted in the Pine Barrens in the later decades of the 20th century, followed the same understanding and pressed it further. Hufford was interested not only in the Jersey Devil as an isolated belief, but in the whole fabric of knowledge and practice and story that Pine Barrens residents carried about their home landscape, the ways of reading weather from the behavior of animals and the feel of the air, the traditional knowledge of which plants grew where and could be relied upon in which seasons, the particular vocabulary that had developed to describe terrain and conditions found nowhere else in quite the same form. The Jersey Devil belief was woven through all of that, not as a separate thread, but as part of the same fabric, one element in a coherent traditional understanding of what the Pine Barrens was and how it worked. To know when and where the creature might be heard, in that understanding, was the same kind of knowledge as knowing when the cedar streams would flood, or where the sundews grew thickest in the bogs. It was knowledge about a place, held by people who had spent their lives in careful attention to it. Hufford recorded that knowledge with a tape recorder in Pine Barrens kitchens and on Pine Barrens porches, in the late afternoon light that comes through the pines at a low angle in autumn, and in the long, slow evenings of summer, when the sounds coming from the woods at the edge of a property shifted gradually from birdsong to the first night, insects to something quieter and harder to name. The people who spoke to her were not performing for an audience. They were sharing, with a visitor who had demonstrated the patience and the interest to hear it, a body of knowledge that was part of how they understood their own lives. The Jersey Devil came up in that context as naturally as the herons came up, or the fog that settled over the cedar swamps on cold autumn mornings, or the way the bog iron had once been gathered from the streams by people 3 and 4 generations back. It was part of the inventory of a life lived in a particular place over a long time. That ordinariness is worth dwelling on. The tendency, when the Jersey Devil appears in any context outside the Pine Barrens itself, is toward drama, toward the 1909 newspaper accounts, the schools closing, the pauses forming, the creature shrieking and rising over rooftops in winter towns. that version of the story is real, those things happened, in the sense that people believed they were happening, and wrote them down and organized their days around that belief. But it is not the only version, and for the communities that have lived longest in the landscape the creature supposedly inhabits, it may not be the most characteristic one. The more characteristic version is the one that sounds like geography rather than legend, the one that names a specific cedar swamp and a specific season and a specific quality of evening, and in which the creature is neither terrifying nor remarkable, but simply present, as the landscape itself is present, on its own terms and in its own time. The charcoal burner's mound, the low earthen structure called a pit or a hearth, built around a central chimney of stacked wood and covered with turf and sand to control the burn, would have been a common sight in the Pine Barrens interior through much of the 19th century. A worker tending such a mound would spend days at a time in the same clearing, sleeping in a rough shelter nearby, waking through the night to adjust the airflow and maintain the slow, oxygen-limited combustion that converted pitch pine to charcoal. The air in such a clearing would have been saturated with the sweet, sharp smell of burning resin, the smoke hanging low in the still air of the interior where the pines broke the wind. The sounds of the surrounding forest would have been constant company, the birds, the insects, the particular silence of the deeper swamps a quarter-mile off the main track. Anything moving through the brush at night would have been audible. The charcoal burner, alone in the interior for days at a stretch, would have been attentive to those sounds in the way that anyone becomes attentive to sounds when they are the primary information available about the surrounding world. Some of those sounds would have been identifiable. Some would not have been. What was not identifiable in the Pine Barrens interior, in the dark, far from any road or settlement, was simply part of the landscape, one more thing that the pines contained, one more aspect of a place that was never quite fully known. The knowledge that Pine Barrens residents held about the creature was not, in most cases, the product of dramatic personal encounters. It was more often the product of accumulated awareness, of living in a place long enough that the ordinary sounds and signs of the landscape had been sorted and identified, so that what remained unidentified stood out against the background of the known. A person who knew what a great horned owl sounded like at 2 a.m, who knew the sound that a white-tailed deer made moving through a cedar thicket, who knew the particular cry of a red fox in late winter, was in a position to notice when something they heard did not fit any of those categories. What they did with that noticing depended on who they were and what framework they had for understanding the unexplained. In Pine Barrens communities, the framework that was available included the creature, not as an explanation, but as a placeholder, a name for the category of things that the landscape contained that had not yet been, or perhaps could not be, fully accounted for. There is a practical relationship to mystery in that attitude that is different from the one that produces newspaper hysteria or organized posses. It is the relationship of people who have made their peace with living in a place that is larger than their knowledge of it. The Pine Barrens are genuinely large, in the specific sense that matters here, large enough to contain things that are not regularly seen, old enough to have accumulated a history that is not fully recorded, complex enough ecologically that the inventory of what lives within them has always been incomplete in some of its details. The communities that have inhabited that landscape for generations did not find that incompleteness disturbing. They found it characteristic. The pines held what they held, including the things that had not been named, and the things that could only be named approximately, and the work of living there was to know as much of it as possible while holding the remainder with equanimity. That equanimity was not simple or unearned. It was built from the same accumulation of observation and practice that produced the botanical knowledge and the weather reading and the particular vocabulary of the pines. It required generations of careful attention to a specific place, and it required the transmission of what that attention had produced through the channels of family and community that kept traditional knowledge alive. It was the quality that the Kallikak study and its framework of hereditary deficiency had found invisible, had classified under the rubric of incapacity, had used to justify institutional harm. And it was precisely that quality, the patient, grounded, place-specific competence of people who had given their full attention to a particular landscape over a very long time, that Hufford and Halpert and the other folklorists who worked in the Pine Barrens were trying to document before the communities that held it changed in ways that would make the knowledge harder to recover. The tape recorder in the Pine Barrens kitchen, in the late afternoon light that comes in low through the window above the sink, picks up the sound of a chair shifting, a cup set down on a wooden surface, the faint background of the pines outside, and then a voice, speaking without hurry, about the woods and the seasons and the old preparations and the creatures said to move through the swamp on particular kinds of nights. The voice knows all of these things with the same degree of familiarity. None of them is more remarkable than the others. The Jersey Devil belongs to a specific cedar swamp that is named in the conversation a few miles from where the speaking is happening, as naturally and as specifically as the herons that nest along the river bend, as the cranberries that grow low and dark in the flooded sections, as the cedar trees that stand in close formation along the dark water stream and have been standing there in the same formation or one much like it for longer than any record goes back. The folklorist sits across the table, listening carefully, the tape moving slowly through the machine, the light outside shifting as afternoon moves toward evening, and the sounds from the edge of the property begin to change. Mary Hufford's attention, directed across that kitchen table, was not extractive in the way that the Kallikak fieldwork had been. She was not arriving with a set of categories already determined and a framework already in place that would make the knowledge she encountered fit a predetermined conclusion. She was arriving with a genuine interest in what was there, in the specific, embodied, place-rooted knowledge of people who had lived in the Pine Barrens long enough that the landscape had become legible to them in ways it could not be to someone passing through. What the tape caught in those conversations was not a collection of quaint survivals from a simpler time. It was the active, living product of a serious and ongoing engagement with a complex and specific place. The Jersey Devil was part of that product, not as a piece of folklore detached from everything else, but as one thread in a fabric that included plant knowledge and weather reading and the memory of where the bog iron had been gathered, and the names of families who had built the charcoal mounds and tended the furnaces and moved through the same interior paths for generations before. The light through the kitchen window has gone amber now, the low, late afternoon light of a season that is moving toward its end. Outside, the pines hold the color for a moment before the shadow comes up from the east, and the whole landscape shifts toward a more even, neutral tone. The sounds from the woods at the edge of the property have begun their slow transition. Fewer birds, the first suggestions of the night insects not yet fully present, a brief, wide quiet between the two. In that quiet, the conversation in the kitchen continues, and the tape moves, and the knowledge that had traveled through families and through seasons and through the whole long, patient history of people living in close attention to a particular landscape is being preserved in a new medium, carried forward in a form that will outlast the afternoon, outlast the season, outlast perhaps the speaker and the listener, both, into whatever comes next for the Pine Barrens and the people who have always called it home. From somewhere out across the open water of a sphagnum bog in the Pine Barrens, on a warm night in May, the tree frogs are calling. Not one or two, but hundreds, the sound coming from every direction at once, rising from the sedges and the still dark surface of the water and the soft peat at the bog's edge, filling the air with a low, continuous, overlapping chorus that is less like individual voices and more like the bog itself producing sound, as if the water and the moss and the warm air above them have found a frequency they can all agree on and are holding it together through the night. The calls come without urgency. They rise and they overlap and they settle back and they rise again, the whole sound moving in a slow collective rhythm that has nothing in it to alarm or press. Standing at the edge of that bog in the dark, with the water just barely visible as a faint shine between the sedge stems and the air soft and carrying the faint mineral smell of wet peat, the sound fills in around everything else until it becomes the ground the night is resting on. The Pine Barrens tree frog is a small animal, resting on a stem at the water's edge. It is easy to overlook, a compact green shape, its back the color of new leaves, its flanks carrying a faint pale stripe, the whole creature no longer than a thumb. It lives almost entirely within the bounds of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, and a few scattered, isolated populations in the Carolinas, and along the Florida Panhandle, populations separated from the main body of their kind by hundreds of miles and generations beyond counting. The acidic bogs and seeps of the Pine Barrens interior are its particular requirement. The water must be cold, the soil must be peaty. The chemistry of the place, built up over millennia by the slow accumulation of sphagnum moss and the tannin leaching of fallen leaves, and the acid wash of slow cedar-stained streams, must be exactly what it is. Other landscapes will not do. The frog's range is not just a matter of what is available, but of what the frog, down to its cells, has become fitted for through long association with a particular, peculiar patch of the world. In May and June, the males call from the bog margins in numbers that transform an otherwise quiet stretch of interior pines into something that seems, in the dark, much larger than it is. The calling is a simple honking sound, not melodic, not especially musical, but persistent and layered until it acquires a kind of depth that individual voices would not produce on their own. Females move toward the sound. Eggs are laid in the shallow water among the sphagnum, and then the season moves on. By midsummer the calling has subsided, and the bog has returned to its quieter self. The tree frogs still there, but distributed through the vegetation, small and still and difficult to find, waiting for the following spring. What they do in the intervening months follows the pattern of the bog, slow, responsive, shaped by temperature and season, going forward with the particular patience of a creature that has been doing this in the same kind of place for a very long time. The sphagnum moss the frogs call from is itself one of the quieter wonders of the Pine Barrens. A single mat of it, spread across the surface of a bog, is not one thing, but many, dozens of species of sphagnum can be found across the pine lands, each one adapted to slightly different conditions of moisture and light and acidity, each one building the same slow architecture of waterlogged peat beneath itself as it grows. The upper layers are alive and green and actively growing. The lower layers, compressed under the weight of what has accumulated above, are entering a kind of long suspension, half decayed, but held in place by the cold and the acid, preserved in the same way that other organic things are preserved in bogs across the world, slowly, thoroughly, indefinitely. What grows at the surface, and what persists below are part of the same process, just at different stages of a sequence that has no particular hurry about it. Growing from the surface of that sphagnum in the wetter and more open sections of pine barrens bogs are the sundews. Two species are common here, the round-leaved sundew and the spatulate-leaved sundew, and both of them present the same extraordinary arrangement to any insect moving low across the bog surface. Each leaf is covered in long reddish hairs, and each hair is tipped with a small bead of sticky mucilage that catches the afternoon light and holds it, the whole leaf glittering as if covered in dew that the morning never dried. An insect landing on a leaf does not land easily again. The mucilage holds. The hairs, slowly and without any discernible haste, begin to curl inward around the trapped insect, folding it toward the center of the leaf, where digestion can begin. The whole process, from landing to complete digestion, takes several days. The sundew does not rush. The bog provides no reason to. The reason for this, on its surface, is straightforward. The water in a pine barrens bog is extremely poor in the dissolved minerals that most plants take up through their roots. The soil is too acidic, the water too pure and too fast-moving in the ways that matter for nutrient chemistry, and the sphagnum itself actively competes with other plants for what little is available. The sundew's solution, arrived at across many generations of variation and selection, was to stop relying on the soil for nitrogen and other key nutrients, and to take them instead from the bodies of small animals that could be caught and digested on the leaf surface. This is not unusual behavior in the sense of being rare. Carnivorous plants have evolved independently many times in many different lineages across the world. But knowing that does not make a sundew leaf, held up to the light with a small fly already half enclosed by the curling hairs, any less particular. The plant goes about its business. The bog holds still around it. The air above is warm and carries the faint sweet smell of the open water nearby. Elsewhere in the pine barrens, away from the bogs and out along the sandy roads and sunny clearings of the interior, a different kind of life is going about its own unhurried work. In September, when the air is beginning to carry the first suggestion of the turn toward autumn, and the sand roads are still warm in the afternoon, it is possible to come across an eastern timber rattlesnake lying fully extended across the pale surface of a road through the pitch pines. Not coiled, not positioned for anything in particular, just stretched out across the warm sand, absorbing heat with the broad, efficient surface of its body, its scales catching the light in a pattern of brown and gold chevrons that repeats from neck to rattle in a design that has been refined across enormous stretches of time for exactly the conditions of this landscape. The snake is not interested in the road as road. The road interests it only as a warm, open surface in a landscape of considerable shade, a place where the sun reaches the ground and the ground holds the heat, and the heat enters the body and slows the long slide toward winter. The eastern timber rattlesnake has declined substantially across most of its range in New Jersey. Habitat loss, persecution, and the fragmentation of the forested landscapes it requires have reduced its presence in the state to a fraction of what it once was. The pine barrens hold one of the remaining meaningful populations in the state, and the reason is partly the same reason much of the pine barrens has remained intact. The landscape is, by the standards of coastal development, difficult and unrewarding. The sandy soil does not grow crops easily. The terrain is flat, but traversal through the interior is not simple. The pines close in, and the cedar swamps are wet, and the roads are few, and the place has, for a long time, been considered by people outside it as marginal. What is marginal for certain kinds of use turns out to be favorable for the rattlesnake, and for the tree frog, and for the sundew, and for a great many other things that have found in the particular difficulty of the pine barrens a kind of shelter that more hospitable landscapes do not offer. The rattlesnake lying on the road in September is not a danger to approach carefully with the right kind of attention. Given space and the ordinary courtesy of not cornering it, it will move off into the pines when it is ready, the rattle sounding once, or perhaps not at all, the heavy body flowing into the scrub with a steadiness that looks unhurried because it is. The timber rattlesnake is not by nature a confrontational animal. It relies on its camouflage, which is considerable, and on its patience, which is also considerable. It spends much of its life in positions of stillness, waiting for the ambient temperature to do what it needs to do, or waiting for the small mammals that move through the interior forest. The rattle itself is a warning, an announcement of presence made to animals that might otherwise step on something they did not see. It is, in its way, a courtesy extended across species. Far to the south and east, where the pine barrens give way to the barrier islands and coastal marshes at the lower end of New Jersey, the narrow peninsula of Cape May reaches out into the junction of Delaware Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. In October, the sky above Cape May is sometimes full of hawks. Not a few hawks, not a loose scattering of birds moving in the same general direction, but thousands of them, broad-winged hawks, and sharp-shinned hawks, and Cooper's hawks, and merlins, and peregrine falcons, and ospreys, and bald eagles, and golden eagles, all of them funneled south by the shape of the land into this narrow corridor where the peninsula's tip forces them to collect before crossing water. The migration is one of the most concentrated raptor movements on the continent. Birdwatchers have been coming to Cape May to witness it for well over a century. On a good October morning, with the wind from the northwest and the sky clear, it is possible to count tens of thousands of birds in a single day. What produces this concentration is geography. Raptors migrating down the eastern seaboard are reluctant to cross open water when they can avoid it, and the peninsula of Cape May is from the air, a long and gradually narrowing funnel that collects birds traveling along the coastline and delivers them to a point where the water crossing is at its shortest. The birds do not choose this route because they understand the geography. They follow the land because following the land has, over countless generations, produced better outcomes for their kind than flying out over open ocean. The result, seen from below, on a favorable autumn morning, is a sky that appears to be slowly organizing itself into a river moving southwest, the individual birds riding thermals upward in loose spirals, and then streaming off toward the bay crossing, the whole column continuously fed from above, and continuously draining toward the south, going on for hours with a kind of collective momentum that no individual bird within it is directing. Ospreys move through in numbers that make them seem common, though they are not common across the broader landscape, the way they once were. Peregrines move through in tight, purposeful lines, not riding the thermals, but cutting across them on long pointed wings, the fastest birds on the flyway, and among the fastest animals alive in a dive. Bald eagles pass in ones and twos, large and unhurried, the white of the head and tail visible from a considerable distance against the pale autumn sky, all of them passing through the same corridor, along the same edge of the continent, drawn by the same geography that has been drawing their kind south, each autumn for longer than the names for any of these birds have existed. The pine barrens that border Cape May and extend northward through the interior of the state are, at night, and particularly in the deeper sections of the interior forest, a place of considerable quiet. The pitch pines close overhead, The sandy roads between them are pale in starlight. The cedar swamps, a short distance from the road through the darker interior, are producing the faint cedar and tannin smell that the interior pines carry in all seasons. The water moving slowly through the roots and the accumulated duff of the swamp floor, with a sound too quiet to be called a sound, more of a faint, continuous presence just below the threshold of clear hearing. It is in the deep interior of the pine barrens, in these dark stretches of forest, far from any paved road or lit window, that the strange lights have been reported for as long as people have moved through this landscape at night. Not the lights of approaching cars or the glow of distant towns reflected on low cloud. Something else, something smaller and closer and more self-contained, seen drifting among the pitch pines or hovering briefly at the margin of a cedar swamp before going out. The accounts of these lights go back across centuries. They appear in early settler accounts and in the recollections of piney families who have known this forest for generations, described consistently as pale and bluish or faintly greenish, moving or stationary, appearing without warning and disappearing the same way, not attached to any visible source. Several explanations have been proposed over the years, and none of them alone accounts for every version of what has been reported. One of the more studied candidates is foxfire, bioluminescence produced by certain species of fungi as they grow through decaying wood. Foxfire fungi, which belong to several different genera, produce a faint blue-green light as a byproduct of the chemical reactions involved in breaking down the wood fibers they consume. The light is real and has been photographed and measured. On a dark night in the right conditions, a section of fallen log colonized by foxfire fungi will glow faintly enough to be visible to eyes that have fully adjusted to the dark, though not brightly enough to read by or to cast a shadow of any significance. The light does not flicker. It does not move. It is simply there, steady and cool, emanating from a log that is in the process of very slowly becoming something else. Other proposed explanations include the ignition of gases seeping from boggy ground. Methane and related gases produced by anaerobic decomposition in waterlogged soil can, under certain conditions, ignite at the surface, producing a brief flame that might be seen as a moving light at a distance. The conditions for this are specific and not common. Another possibility involves the particular way that atmospheric conditions above the flat, open pine barrens canopy can, on nights with certain temperature gradients and moisture content in the air, refract and bend light from distant sources in ways that make those lights appear to hover or move at intermediate distances. None of these explanations exclude the others. The lights that have been seen in the pine barrens over the centuries were probably not all one thing. The landscape is large enough and old enough and varied enough in its conditions and its seasons to produce more than one kind of unexplained glow. What the lights share across all their reported versions is the quality of belonging to the interior, to the parts of the pine barrens where the forest is dense enough to make direction uncertain, and where the ordinary landmarks of paved roads and power lines and the distant orange wash of suburban lighting are absent. The interior of the Pinelands National Reserve, 1,000,000 acres and more of pitch pine and cedar swamp and bog and sandy road, is one of the genuinely dark places remaining on the heavily lit eastern seaboard. On a clear night far from its edges, the sky above the pine canopy holds stars that are not visible from most of coastal New Jersey. The Milky Way is present and faint and real. The trees below it are a dark mass against a slightly lighter dark, and between them the sandy roads are pale strips running toward distances that at night feel larger than they do by day. The tree frog calling from the sphagnum at the bog's edge is part of this darkness in the way that all the other living things in the pine barrens interior are part of it, not in spite of it, but through it, using it, going on within it, with the ease of creatures whose lives have always been arranged around conditions that include long hours of dark and cold and wet and the particular chemistry of this soil and this water and no other. The frog does not require the night to be anything other than what it is. The sundew does not require the bog to be richer or warmer or less acidic. The rattlesnake does not require the pine barrens road to be anything other than a warm surface in a cool season. Each of them is fitted to its conditions with the close, exact fit of things that have been in relationship with a particular place for long enough that the place and the creature have shaped each other's edges. The pitch pines stand over all of this in the same way they have stood over it through centuries of fire and recovery and growth and fire again. The bark of a mature pitch pine is thick and deeply furrowed, assembled in irregular plates that insulate the living wood beneath against temperatures that would kill a thinner barked tree outright. The resin in the wood is present in such concentration that a pitch pine trunk cut and left will resist decay for decades while other wood rots around it. The cones on the upper branches are sealed with the same resin, holding their seeds against years of ordinary seasons, waiting for the one condition that will open them, the sustained, intense heat of a wildfire moving through the understory below. When the fire comes, the cones open, the seeds fall onto ground that has been cleared and fertilized by ash, into soil that has been opened to light by the removal of competing vegetation, and the next generation of pitch pines begins from the same catastrophe that might seem, from outside the system's logic, to have destroyed everything. Nothing was destroyed. The system ran. The pines, after the fire, stand with their crowns intact above the scorched understory, a little blackened at the base, no more than typically altered by a process they have been shaped to survive and to use. Below the ground, the deep root systems of the mature trees are undisturbed. In the ash-covered sand between the standing trees, the serotinous seeds that fell from the opened cones are already beginning the process that will, in a season or two, produce the next low canopy of seedlings. The bog, a short distance from the burned ground, was probably never touched by the fire at all. The moisture content of the sphagnum and the open water keep it largely fireproof, and the frogs and the sundews and the slow, cold chemistry of the bog water continue without interruption while the forest around the bog's edge enters its next cycle. The cedar streams that run through the interior of the pinelands move darkly through all of this, their water stained by tannins leached from the decaying organic matter of the forest floor, and the bog, running the color of very old tea or of dark amber held up to a low light. The color is not an impurity in any ordinary sense. The water is among the cleanest in the region, having filtered down through layer after layer of fine quartz sand before entering the stream system, carrying the dissolved tannins as a record of the organic matter it has passed through on its way to the open channel. Atlantic white cedars line the banks of these streams in places, their straight dark trunks rising from the shallow water at the margins, their crowns forming a canopy that closes over the stream in the narrower channels and holds the light out, making the interior of the cedar swamp dim even in midday and genuinely dark by late afternoon. The stillness inside a cedar swamp on a windless day is a particular kind of stillness, not the absence of sound so much as the filtering of it, the way the dense cedar canopy and the soft, absorbent sphagnum floor reduce everything to a murmur and a faint drip, and the occasional movement of water beneath the surface that is more felt than heard. The light that reaches the swamp floor through the cedar canopy arrives at angles and in small broken patches, moving slowly across the dark water as the sun tracks overhead, touching the surface briefly and then going. The water does not rush. Where it moves at all, it moves slowly, carrying its cargo of dissolved tannin and fine organic particles toward the lower stretches of the stream, where the channel widens and the cedars thin and the light returns. Below the stream bed, many feet below, the Cohansey aquifer receives what the streams and the rain together deliver, holding it in the immense stillness of water in rock, a reservoir too large to fully picture and too slow to track from season to season. What persists in the pine barrens is not any single thing but the relationship between all of them, the fire and the pine, the bog and the frog, the tannin and the cedar, the sand and the aquifer, and the slow, cold percolation of rain through clean white quartz. Each element in the system is what it is, partly because of its relationship to the others. The pitch pine is a fire-adapted tree because the landscape it inhabits produces fire. The tree frog lives in acid bogs because its ancestors lived in acid bogs, and the frogs that thrived there passed on the traits that allowed thriving in those conditions. The cedar stream runs dark because the bog and the decaying organic matter upstream are exactly what they are, and the tannins they produce are exactly what they produce. And the stream carries that specific chemistry down through the specific sandy corridors of the specific landscape it has cut over the specific centuries of its existence. The bog iris blooms in June at the margins of pine barrens, seeps, its blue-violet flowers appearing at the edge of the sphagnum in a color that seems against the brown and green and rust of the bog, slightly improbable, too vivid for a landscape that otherwise keeps its palette muted and close to the earth. It blooms for a short time. The flowers are gone before July. The leaves continue through the summer and into the fall, and then the plant retreats into the root system and the cold ground and the long pause of winter, and then it is June again, and the flowers appear once more, as if arriving for the first time. The bog does not remember the previous June. The iris does not either, in any sense that would count as memory. The season comes around, the conditions present themselves, and the plant does what the plant does. In the deepest part of the night, past midnight, when the tree frogs have settled into a quieter register, and the bog surface has gone still, and the pitch pines along the road through the interior are dark shapes against a slightly lighter sky, the foxfire is there. Not everywhere, not in quantities that could be called abundant, but there, on a fallen pitch pine log in a section of interior forest, where the trees are close and the canopy overhead holds the darkness down. The fungus growing through the rotting wood of the log is producing its faint, steady, blue-green light as it works, the glow barely bright enough to separate from the general dark, barely bright enough to catch the attention of eyes that have been in the forest long enough to adjust to the true depth of the night here. The light does not flicker. It does not move toward or away. It is simply the byproduct of something happening inside the log, a chemical process, patient and sustained, the same kind of process that has been breaking down fallen wood in wet forests since before any name for fungi existed, since before any name for anything existed. The log is returning to soil. The process is working slowly and completely. The way these processes work without urgency and without interruption. The living wood fibers, one by one, becoming something that can enter the soil and become part of what grows from the soil next. The light that the fungi produce is incidental to all of this. It is not for anything. It glows because the chemistry of this particular decomposition in these particular species produces photons as a byproduct, and the photons travel outward through the air in the way that photons do, reaching the eyes of whatever is present in the dark to receive them. The forest extends outward from that log in every direction. The pitch pines stand in their wide-spaced rows, their root systems reaching through the pale quartz sand. The cedar swamps lie in the low ground between the pine ridges, their water moving slowly and darkly through the roots. The sphagnum bogs hold the still water of the interior above the deeper cold of the aquifer below. The tree frogs, quieter now in the depth of the night, rest on their sedge stems at the bog's edge.